The hazing scandal at Northwestern University has thrown the athletic program into turmoil. Longtime football coach Pat Fitzgerald has been fired, and the legal fallout has just begun. A number of former players from different sports have filed lawsuits against the school. The alleged hazing incidents at Northwestern University have sparked a larger conversation about hazing not only in college, but in high school and in other extracurricular activities. I'm Rob Hart. In the next hour, we'll talk to three experts on hazing about where it's happening and what parents can do if they suspect it's happening to their children. We're joined today by Dr. Susan Lipkins, who's a psychologist and expert witness in hazing cases based in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. You can find her online at insidehazing.com, and by Dr. Elizabeth Allan, professor of higher education and program coordinator at the University of Maine, also a principal at Stop Hazing, a research to practice organization. Her website is stophazing.org. And by Dr. Lisa Stephen, personal career and performance coach and psychologist and owner of Ignite Peak Performance in Shelburne, Vermont. Find her at ignitepeakperformance.com. Thank you very much for joining me today. Let's start off with your reaction to the allegations to come out of the Northwestern football program. Former players talking about rituals of sexual humiliation, naked drills, and are being forced to drink protein shakes until they got sick. Dr. Lipkins, in your judgment, is this a textbook case of hazing?
Yes, I have been seeing sexualized hazing occurring in high schools throughout the country for the last 20 years and in colleges. So to me, it was shocking to everybody else. It was not shocking to me. The shocking part was that people were breaking the code of silence and willing to talk about it.
Is this a common practice even in 2023, and even with a great deal of institutional effort to push back on it?
I think that it is common, and I'm not quite sure how much institutional practice there is. So I would question what the colleges are actually doing, how the coaches think about hazing, what they're doing. When I speak to coaches and I say, how many minutes are you spending talking about hazing? They say 60 seconds. And when I say why, they say, well, we have to win or we're going to lose our jobs, so that's more important.
Dr. Allan, when it comes to hazing, there is the stereotypical hazing situations, fraternity and sorority initiation rituals, and in sports. Are there other places in which hazing occurs outside of those settings?
Absolutely, yes. And in our research, starting with a national study that we did across collecting data from students enrolled in more than 50 different colleges and universities, we found that hazing occurred in many different types of clubs, organizations, and teams. Of course, as you mentioned, varsity athletics and fraternity and sorority life were prevalent. Hazing was prevalent there, but we also saw it in intramural sports, club sports, performing arts organizations such as marching bands, a cappella groups. We even saw it in honor societies and academic clubs as well.
And it seems like the emotional pull of hazing is you want to be a part of this group. And it seems like the choice is, if you want to be a part of this group, you have to participate in this ritual, and that can override whatever misgivings you may have about participating.
Who are you asking?
This would be for anybody who wants to chime in.
Okay, that is not how I would pose it. I don't think that anybody who is involved in a hazing actually has a choice as to whether they're going to be hazed or not.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to hear what my colleagues think.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say the definition of hazing that we use, that is a general, sort of foundational definition, is that it's any activity expected of someone participating in a group that humiliates, abuses, or potentially endangers them, regardless of their willingness to participate. And so that third piece is really important because it recognizes the peer pressure and the power of the group to create a coercive environment. So yeah, I think there is a tendency to blame the victim with hazing, and it's important to recognize that the circumstances in hazing are such that a true consent is really called into question.
Dr. Stephen,
let's coercion.
Dr. Stephen, let's talk about the psychological after effects of hazing and the fact that a participant may not have a choice in that situation, or they do not have a choice in that situation. They do it, and then maybe for months afterwards, or in the case of some of the Northwestern football players, years afterwards, they live with whether it's guilt or just the psychological after effects of what they had done. Just talk a little bit about the psychological harm that hazing can cause in a person, possibly years after the fact.
Yeah, I would argue that it can last a lifetime. And I certainly have plenty of adults that I've seen who are talking about hazing incidences that happened many, many, many years before. And really what you see are things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, depression, certainly self-medicating with substances. And the aftermath is huge. And it's not just the hazing victim, it's everyone else victimized in that process, right? The parents who are traumatized, the community members who are traumatized, the bystanders who maybe knew something or maybe saw something. It's just a catastrophic outcome. And I don't use that word lightly. It is so much more than what people realize.
If someone is dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of hazing, or anxiety disorder as a result of hazing, when they talk to you, what are some of the feelings that they carry with them, and what are some of their emotional triggers?
Well, the triggers generally are anything related to the event itself. So you can see something as concrete as, if you're still on campus, going into the area where the incident occurred. The other big piece that happens is, again, this concept of choice. People start to believe, and certainly youth and college students believe, that they had a choice. So there's a lot of blame and guilt and taking full responsibility for something that they really had no power over. And again, lumping into that the trauma that some of those bystanders experience as well.
Could I make a comment on that? I think that the helplessness that the victim feels when they're in another situation, they could be 10, 20, 30 years later, when they're in a situation like that, a tremendous amount of emotion comes up, and often it's huge anger. I worry that people who are not treated for their post-traumatic stress after their hazing will be put into another situation that doesn't look like anything like hazing, but makes them feel the same way. And then their reaction will be an overreaction. And people were going, oh my God, where did that come from? But it could be dangerous. In other words, if they're ever in, to me, hazing always happens in a group that has a hierarchy, and they're trying to maintain that hierarchy. So they could be in a corporate environment. They could be in a church group. They could be somewhere else where there's a hierarchy and something triggers them, and then their emotion is much stronger than the situation, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, which is why it's so important that people who have been victimized or involved in a hazing actually get some treatment. And I agree with you that they will need treatment throughout their life, because even if they're better now, there's something that can trigger it later.
And they often don't know. So you have a person now 50 years old at work who can't understand why they feel so intensely, or why they're so irritable, or they're raising their voice, or they feel so frightened, and not necessarily connecting that back with some of what they experienced many years before.
Now, Dr. Allan, if you are a parent, and let's say you have a child who has joined, hypothetically, the marching band at college, and unbeknownst to you, the marching band has a hazing ritual, and it may seem harmless at first, but there are some psychological after effects. What are some things that what are some kind of signs in your child that maybe things are not necessarily right, and they're carrying some psychological baggage after that hazing ritual?
Well, I definitely defer to my colleagues on this, but I mean, I'll start off by saying we do on the stophazing.org website provide some resources around sort of red flags, things to look for that might be signs of hazing. They could be, just changes in behavior, sleep disturbances, withdrawing from regular activities and interactions with the family, not associating with their usual group of friends. There are, a number of sort of red flags or warning signs that I would encourage families to be aware of. And I'll also just mention that our research shows that students are more likely to report or share about hazing experiences with their families than they are to report it to a campus official. And so it is vital for parents and families and caregivers to become educated on what to do should they learn about hazing or suspect hazing is happening, and know where to report it and how to talk to their students about what's happening. And I know Dr. Stephen has written recently about this in a blog post for the Stop Hazing website. So I think love to hear what you think about this, Dr. Stephen.
Yeah, one of the things I think that's important to think about as a parent that might not be obvious is before you even get to the point where you're going to be talking about hazing or any scary thing that might be happening to your child, to really just check in with yourself, to think about what are my feelings around this. And the reason for that is we as parents get upset. I mean, it's a horrible thing to think about your child being hazed. And that can lead us to minimize it and tell ourselves, oh, no, that wouldn't happen. We picked our college, so, they were so careful and we know the coach. The other thing that happens that we're unaware of is thinking about the messages we're sending to our kids. We want them to have fun. So if our child is coming to us and saying, I feel a little uncomfortable, or they're not really telling us in a forthright manner, we might urge them to continue because we're wanting them to join in the fun, not realizing that they are potentially in a dangerous situation. So my top tips are starting first with that idea of self-reflecting as a parent, really then thinking with your teen or college student about hazing, thinking about things like it's normal for them to want to belong. Contrary to popular belief, it's not a belief that they're invincible that makes them more vulnerable. It's the belongingness. Normalizing that with them, talking about that with them, then moving into talking about the facts of hazing, looking at cases, thinking about that together, and hear what I'm saying, together with them. And most importantly, what will your plan be? If you feel something that's conflicting with your values, you have a bad gut instinct, something's not right, what will you do? And getting a very concrete plan together.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. I've been involved in hazing in marching bands. And the way you're looking at it, Rob, is that like as if hazing is one thing, but particularly in marching bands, it can be the entire year. It's not an event. Hazing has a beginning and a middle and an end. It's a repetition of a tradition that's happened before. And I have found, especially on college campuses, that it's like multi-level, ongoing, often brutal, and very difficult to remove yourself from it. On a college campus, in any situation, the person has to be very brave to break that code of silence and to report it. Hopefully, there are many ways to report it anonymously, and hopefully there's a good group who will investigate it. But even making that decision, I was working with a family recently, so they're at an Ivy League school and a great team, and they have a scholarship, they don't have a scholarship, they'd like to stay at the school, they don't want to stay on the team, they've been hazed, they don't want to haze the next group. What do? Do they report it, or do they wait till they graduate, or do they leave the college? All these kinds of questions are very personal and very complicated. And I'd like, as much as a hazing expert, I want everybody to report it. On the other hand, I think you have to be understanding that it's not an easy process and that there will be consequences to that. And you have to be clear on what those consequences are and there you have a choice. When to report, to whom to report, how to report, whether you want to stay in that group or not, what's important to you, then you have a choice. When you're being hazed, you don't have a choice.
And then it's a very good point you bring up, Dr. Lipkins, about the fact that it's not just a ritual or a day or a week. It could be a year-long process until you have moved up in the hierarchy, and then maybe you become an enthusiastic hazer as opposed to a hazing victim. So can you talk a little bit about the just the perpetuating the cycle, that psychological damage that hazing can inflict? And you talk about ways in which people can manifest that in later on in life, maybe decades later, but maybe they really enjoy doing it to somebody else once they have the opportunity to do so.
Is there somebody specific?
Well, we'll start with you, Dr. Lipkins.
Okay. I believe I call it the blueprint of hazing, where people come in, they want to join the team, and they're victimized. And then the next season, they become a bystander and they watch as other people get hazed. Some people are active bystanders, like saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. And some are passive, saying, oh my God, I don't want to be here. And then eventually they are in the senior status and they feel like they have the right and the duty to repeat those traditions. And they take that entire blueprint and they take it from high school, they put it in their backpack, they bring it with them to college, to the military, and to the workplace. And they're kind of pre-ready. They expect something to happen. Now, what the audience needs to understand is hazing is not like when you go to the surgeon and the surgeon says, so there's a possibility this and this and this might happen. In fact, when people who want to join the group say, is there hazing? They say, no. Do you burn? No. Do you paddle? No. Do you make me drink X amount of alcohol and Y amount of time? No, no, no. And then the hazing begins and those kids get it even harder. So there is no truth in the groups that haze. Let's start out there. I'm not quite sure I'm answering your question.
Well, Dr. Allan, let's move on to you. And in terms of when you hear people talking about like breaking the cycle of hazing or investigating hazing, where they say, well, in this organization, we do this and it's X, Y, and Z. But as Dr. Lipkin said, we don't make somebody drink until they get sick. We don't make we don't paddle. We don't make people do things that are violent or harmful. It's more or less like silly pranks. We make somebody go steal a sign. We have a hell week that's just basically they don't take a shower, or we make the freshmen wear a dress or something like that. And they say, well, it's okay because it doesn't reach that level of harm. And your response to that would be what?
It's still hazing. And I think there are other ways, there are healthier ways to welcome people into a group, of course. And so I would also note from the research that we have data showing that those who experience those kinds of types of hazing that people might consider harmless pranks or more benign than the violence kind of hazings that make the headlines, we find that there is a link between students who experience those behaviors and the experience of violence behaviors. So it's all hazing, and it's all unacceptable in the context of our schools and colleges and universities and workplaces. And there are many healthy ways to engage in welcoming people to a group and maintaining traditions and so forth. And so that's what we really have to focus on, is the behavior we want to see and how can we build the skills for that. That's something that we're really investing a lot of time in terms of prevention. And I also wanted to mention, in relation to your earlier question about the cycle, I fully agree that that students are experiencing hazing as early as middle school, we know from research, and then in high school, and then coming to college with expectations that this might be, is sort of normalized. At the same time, our research, our data collection, when we ask about attitudes related to hazing, the vast majority of students say hazing's not acceptable. However, when you ask those same students what they think their peers think, their peers think it's acceptable. So there's a real disconnect. And so what we can do, hopefully, is to correct that misperceived norm, because we know it really matters to anyone, not just students, what their peers think or what they think their peers think. And so if we can correct that misperceived norm through education and awareness, then we can hopefully close that gap and help students to recognize like their peers think similar to them, and they'd be more likely to speak out and intervene as a bystander.
Dr. Stephen, let's talk a little bit about the peer pressure component, that people obviously feel pressured into participating in these hazing rituals. But what about pressure from adults as well, where you could say, and we saw this with just talking to people in the wake of the Northwestern scandal, where, oh, well, this is just society going soft. This was, these are people who are just conditioned to whine and complain. There's nothing wrong with these rituals because they build a sense of coherence, and it's a part of bonding, and it's a tradition that has been passed along for many years. And maybe if you are a person who was hazed and you want to report it to someone or talk about it to someone, you may discover that you encounter an adult who thinks there's no harm in that particular ritual. And what do you do?
Well, I think that is very common, and I can't speak to it from a research standpoint, but I can speak to it from a practice standpoint. The vast majority of cases that I've been involved in, coaches, assistant coaches, and/or, well, certainly the captains of, let's say, an athletic sports team knew what was going on and knew that there was a lot of trauma and people were, crying and trying to get out of the experience. I have had so many student athletes in particular actually go to coaching staff and not necessarily tell them exactly what was happening, but tell them enough so that the coaching staff would know, presumably. And the message back, unfortunately, has been that you need to participate in the group, that these are the norms, this is what we do, you need to show your allegiance, you need to show your loyalty. And so there's the peer pressure element, but there is also, and I don't want to, again, speak to the research, but from a practice standpoint, I hear those stories about this incredible pressure from the program to belong. And so then where'd you go? Many of the schools that I've been involved with don't have obvious reporting mechanisms. And again, Dr. Allan can speak to this in terms of the state of affairs at various colleges and universities, but don't necessarily have anonymous reporting procedures in place. It's something I've pointed out repeatedly in my work to a number of very prestigious institutions where you cannot find anything about it. I'm hopeful that this kind of an effort will help these young people then be more likely to go to their families and to speak about it and to get help.
Dr. Lipkins and Dr. Allan, on the research standpoint, we're talking about where hazing shows up. It's associated with college. You hear about it in high school, but at the middle school level, that is shocking to me. What are some examples of hazing in middle school?
Dr. Allan, you want to start?
Sure. Well, there's one study that was published that documented hazing as early as 6th grade. And it included a range of behaviors, from the humiliation and degrading names to bullying types of behaviors, sexualized kinds of behaviors, and eating vile substances. It can be many different things. And that's a really important point in terms of hazing. And I hope that viewers will be able to reflect on this, and is that, often people ask for a list of what's prohibited when it comes to hazing, and it's impossible to provide an exhaustive list. Although we can talk about what might be some common types of ways hazing occurs. Basically, anything could be hazing. It just depends on how it's implemented. And sadly, we learned that after college students were provided with lists, and one of the things they were told they can't force or encourage new members to drink alcohol. And in the 5 years or so afterwards, we had several deaths from water intoxication. And of course, drinking water would have never made a list of prohibited behaviors for hazing. So I think that's just a really important takeaway, is to think about the context and the manner in which something is implemented. But that's what I know from the research about hazing in middle schools.
Okay, not research, but in reality, I think that parents of middle school kids need to watch out for the excellent athlete who's pulled up from a middle school team into the high school team. So where I've seen it in middle school is, let's say, an 8th grader who's going to be on a 9th grade team because they're so good in every sport. We're talking, it could be tennis, it could be swimming, it could be lacrosse, it could be anything. And that kid is already a target simply because they're younger, they're typically physically smaller, they're definitely naive, and they want nothing more than to belong and to feel like one of the team. They're very proud that they can be on the high school team, and that's the kid who you have to be careful because they're more likely to be targeted. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the freshmen aren't going to be targeted, but that one kid who's coming up from middle school, that is something that parents really need to be careful about. And I've seen it not just in sports, it could be in music, it could be in any kind of area where you're taking a middle school kid and bringing them into, let's say a high school group, that kid is going to be more vulnerable. So if there's a hazing tradition, that kid is going to be more vulnerable to being hazed. If there's no hazing tradition, then there's nothing to worry about.
Dr.
That's
Stephen,
a good
if you know, if you as a parent know that your child has been hazed, your child knows that he or she has been hazed, and they understand the situation, they understand the dynamics involved, and they want to do something about it. It seems like you could be a man or woman alone trying to push back against this. As you said, there aren't formalized means of reporting anonymously, and because group dynamics are so strong and traditions are so strong, if you're trying to push back against something that the group has done and the group has accepted for a very long time, and everybody associated with the group thinks it's okay, you're going to be fighting a lonely fight. And how do you prepare for that?
I actually would throw that over to Dr. Allan, because I think that your research and your preparation in implementing hazing prevention at colleges and universities sets you up to think to speak to that in a little bit in a more effective way than my individual work.
Well, Dr. Allan, you want to take that particular question?
Sure. Can you just run it by me one more time?
I think it's just a matter of if you as a parent know your child is being hazed, your child knows they were hazed. Your parents and the child know this was wrong, and they don't want this to continue. And now you have it's almost like reversing the flow of the river with a plastic cup, because you're just surrounded by so many people in the in-group who believe this is right and it's harmless and this is just something you do. And if you're trying to push back on that, you could be fighting a pretty lonely fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very challenging situation, and I think a lot of support is needed for folks who are going to come forward, and I think we need to do so much more in schools and communities to prepare school officials and to prepare community members to to know how to support survivors who come forward with hazing reports, because it's very similar, the kinds of experience they have to experience, to victims of sexual harassment, sexual violence. For example, sometimes sexual violence is involved in hazing. So you see that overlap as well. But I know Dr. Lipkins has
You're right, I'm waiting.
experience on the ground with this.
I actually call it the second hazing. And what happens is that about 85% of any group, whether it's on campus or in a community in high school, 85% will support the status quo. They will support the coach, even if they know there was hazing. They will support the team. They'll say, you're a pussy. You should have taken it. Everybody takes it. Why did you break the code of silence? 15% will support the victim and their family, or anybody who is breaking the code of silence, or anybody who is coming forward and saying, no, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. Just because our kid wants to play football, that doesn't mean they should be sodomized, right? And I just want to mention that sodomy is very common across athletic teams in high school across the United States, and has been for the last 20 years. So the point is that it is integrated into our culture. Generally, it is accepted by the majority more often than not. It is like swimming upstream if you're going to fight it. And that's what I was saying is, I would love you to stand up and fight it. I'm very proud of the young men at Northwestern and women who are coming forward. But it's a tough fight, and it's something that they have to be ready for. And I would suggest psychological support right away for everybody, for the victim as well as for their family, and to understand that you would think that it's a no-brainer. Nobody wants to get hurt, right? But that's not what happens when it rolls out into real life.
And can I add just 2 quick points there? One, yes, making sure that the victim and also the family gets support, gets into therapy, and making sure that when you are choosing those resources, that it's somebody actually trained in trauma, an actual expert in treating trauma. That is so critical. The other piece I would just add is, I think it's also important to remind ourselves that we talk about these extreme versions or these extreme incidences of hazing where they're out in the open, they're very high profile. But again, these other incidences are happening on a day-to-day basis that are extremely traumatic and degrading, humiliating, scary, powerlessness. So we just don't want to forget that those types of hazing that are seemingly, hidden and people can think of as quote unquote benign are extremely dangerous and extremely harmful.
And this, go ahead.
I think hazing runs from mild to severe, and typically does start out mild, like cross-dressing or dressing up in costumes like they do in Halloween, which makes the person feel comfortable because it's familiar, and they go, oh, I know this isn't so bad. And then it escalates into moderate and eventually very severe. But even stealing the sign, which is something that you said, what's the big deal? So they stole a sign. Well, I have a case where a kid went to steal a sign with 3 other kids, and of course they were sleep deprived because they had to go round trip. And on the way back, there was a nice car accident, and they're paralyzed. So each of these mild things don't necessarily end up with mild endings. And which is why the 3 of us are here today trying to say there is no room for hazing in our society. Not mild, not moderate, not severe, none of it. Because it escalates, it grows. And with each time that there is a hazing, I think the perpetrator wants to add their own mark. So they increase it. They become more humiliating, more sexualized, more paddling, because they are experiencing that feeling of power. And maybe they're also gaining a piece of themselves that was lost when they were hazed.
How has social media changed the practice of hazing, the enforcement of social norms, potentially making it easier to harass people who step out of line or may think about reporting that, or even just supercharging the rumor mill? If somebody does report a hazing, incidents of hazing, there's a lot of, you can use social media to kind of gang up on the person they suspect did it.
You're right.
And this is for everybody.
Okay, you're right. This is, I don't think, Elizabeth, I don't know if you know, I don't think that there's any studies on what the percentage of difficulty has been because of social media. I think the most important piece is that because we're driven by social media in the last decade, 2 decades, the need to belong and have a group that you identify with is even stronger. I think that the membership in fraternities and sororities has increased over the 20 years. And I think that when kids get to college or anywhere, they feel like they have to have a group and an identity. So I think that social media has fed that need that is natural among young adults and adolescents anyhow. I have seen everything you're talking about, cyberbullying, second hazing, using social media, ousting people, isolating them. So you're right, it happens. I've also seen them say, oh, look, that group that did that, so let's add that kind of hazing to our hazing rituals. And so it grows in that way. But I'd like to hear from everybody else as well.
I agree. Of course, it's a factor. And we don't know from the research how much of a factor, but certainly it's a factor. I would also say, though, that it's an opportunity because we can find out through social media about hazing in ways that it might have been more hidden before. And we can do a lot of prevention work with social media. We can, as I was talking about before, we can correct misperceived norms. There's just a lot of opportunity, I think, to also use social media for good and think about ways in which we can shift the culture by messaging in positive ways.
Yeah, and I would just add, I would agree with Dr. Allan in terms of the potential of impacting that, what I consider a drive to belong, this real need and drive to belong for these youth. And that if we can see other kinds of messages in social media, I would be hopeful that it would actually help to shift some of that to be almost preventative, if you will, because they can see a different message and they can realize that their peers really aren't wanting to go along with this either.
On the participation side of things, Dr. Allan, you mentioned that the studies have shown that individual people think hazing is wrong, but they also believe their peers are of the mind that hazing is right. And not everybody belongs to formal organizations. Not everybody is going to rush a fraternity or a sorority. Not everybody is an athlete. Not everybody is going to join a theater group or a marching band or just some sort of organization in which hazing does take place. On a percentage basis, how many people aren't involved in this at all, and how many people are actually involved in hazing, and is there safety in numbers in that they're just the vast majority of people aren't in these groups, aren't being hazed, and may have their own, that they could potentially be an ally?
Oh yeah, I think there's a huge potential for allies, and that's definitely something we're focusing on in terms of prevention work. But I as to your question on the percentages overall, we found in the national study that we did that I mentioned earlier, with more than 11,000 college students, that 55% who belong to clubs, teams, and organizations had experienced hazing. And certainly there were those who did not belong to clubs, teams, and organizations. We still asked them what they knew about it. Many of them, close to 2/3, had knowledge of hazing happening on their campus. And many of those had experienced it in high school. Our study found 47% of students had experienced hazing in high school. Another national study found 48%. And so, even if they haven't experienced it firsthand in college, they know about it. They, in many ways, maybe come to accept it, or expect it, at least, in their communities. And that's something that we really need to work to disrupt, because, and we can do that We can do that with policies and the enforcement of policies and strong messages from leaders on campus, leaders who are administrators, but also student leaders, and just really working to shift those expectations so that students who, even if they don't belong to a club, team, or organization, understand this is not acceptable behavior.
This is a WBBM video presentation about hazing, what you can do as a parent to recognize that in your child, and also if you find yourself as the victim of hazing, what you can do to get help and also to push back. We're joined by Dr. Susan Lipkins, psychologist and expert witness in hazing cases based in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, Dr. Elizabeth Allan, professor of higher education and program coordinator at the University of Maine, and Dr. Lisa Stephen, personal career and performance coach and psychologist and owner of Ignite Peak Performance in Shelburne, Vermont. There have been institutionalized efforts to push back on hazing. Fraternities have been punished for hazing rituals that have been harmful, illegal, and in some cases deadly. Schools say they are doing something about it. Institutions say they are doing something about it. What are some efforts that institutions have undertaken to push back on hazing? And once again, this is for everybody. How much more needs to be done?
So I can start us off. Well, a lot more needs to be done. We are still really in very early stages as far as prevention goes relative to other kinds of forms of harm or potential harm. And so we have still a long way to go in the work that I do with colleges and universities. The kinds of strategies that are being used are many. And we know from research in public health and prevention science that it can't just be one thing. Like having a policy is vital, and enforcing the policy, even more vital. But that's not enough. We need to have a more comprehensive approach, an approach that's grounded in data, so that we know, and we can evaluate the effectiveness of the efforts. But we can do many things. I talked about the visible leadership messaging, the policy enforcement, but also getting groups of people together to participate and engage in prevention messaging, and not only focusing on the behavior we want to stop, which is the hazing, but really focusing also at the same time on the behavior we want to see. So what are we replacing hazing with? How can we build healthy groups and teams and positive leaders on campus where it's far less likely that hazing will happen in their groups? So those kinds of trainings and skill building are vital, in addition to basic awareness about what hazing is, what the red flags are for it, where to report it, how to intervene as a bystander. All these are strategies that campuses are currently using, as well as increased transparency. So ensuring that when there is a hazing incident, that people know and people are told how that group is held accountable, and making that public, because as was mentioned earlier, so many parents who have lost children in hazing incidents actually did their due diligence ahead of time, and they looked to find out what was going on with the group that they're in the case of hazing deaths. It's primarily men who have died in fraternity hazing incidents. And when they came to their parents and said, I want to join this group, their parents looked and didn't find anything until later, after the tragedy, and there was a more in-depth investigation, and then it's revealed there was a pattern of violations. And so that's another effort that's underway, is to, in fact, there is federal legislation proposed to include hazing, the documentation of hazing violations in the annual security reports that are required by law through Clery. And so, but so that's something that's underway, but to date, it's very, it's not uniform or consistent in how that kind of transparency is provided, if any at all.
Can I respond? I think that Dr. Allan has a much more positive view of what works. And I applaud her for all of the efforts and research that she's done. But what I think we really need is something like a National Hazing Prevention Act that would fund a multidisciplinary institute, maybe across the country in 5 or more colleges and universities, that would be working on what actually works as prevention, what works as intervention. How should we be training people to investigate a 1-800 number like we have for child abuse, for hazing, and methods to investigate that? I think from my point of view, the issue is that we want to change a culture, regardless of what the messaging is. And I've seen this at Cornell and other schools where they do everything that they could possibly do. They do report all the hazing events. They do have alternate activities. And then the kids do all that. And then at night they go home and they do their usual traditions, and the kids are still dying and the kids are still hurt. So I think it has to do with, could we train leaders and could we teach groups of kids that as a group they could stop hazing when it's happening, not as an individual. Just like we're having groups of kids come forward in Northwestern now to say, hey, it happened to me, it happened to me, it happened 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it's still happening. So I think it's going to be a movement like the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, where the victims themselves are coming forth, sort of like from inside out, to say, we've had enough, this really has to change.
Dr. Stephen, let's talk about some of the power dynamics that are at play, where someone who is a victim then wants to turn their suffering around and inflict it on somebody else. That is it's a feeling. It is a behavior that is as old as time. And how do you change that dynamic around? Because it is proven throughout history just to be so to be so difficult to resist.
I'm not so sure that is what's happening. I think what's happening is these youth are a part of a culture with these norms. And again, they're all sort of victimized by that, if that makes sense. And they're going to adhere to those norms for all kinds of reasons, to maintain scholarships, to stay at their team, to stay in the band. And so I'm not so sure, and maybe the other folks here understand the research around that it's quite the way you're describing it. I think it's about membership, and I think it's about belonging, and I think it's about doing what you're told. And the other piece I would just add, oftentimes with the seemingly more benign hazing behaviors, they might not even realize they're being hazed. I've seen countless students who have come in upset, depressed, substance abuse issues, who don't even realize necessarily that they've been hazed. So it's just this insidious thing that is so pervasive, and they're trying to belong, and they're trying to do what they're told to do, which is be a part of the team, be a part of the band, be a part of the club.
I think that if you go back to the blueprint of hazing, the kids who are now in the power position feel they have a right and a duty. So it's sort of like, think about it. When you celebrate a birthday, you're supposed to get candles and blow out the candles, or you're supposed to have a birthday cake. So they think they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, passing on the tradition. Mm-hmm. Now, I have seen, as an expert in various cases, that, as you've suggested, that power has a certain flavor that some people basically really like. And so they abuse that power even more than they need to in order to pass on that tradition. And we see that in the Stanford prison experiment, so to speak. But so I think that does exist. And I think that definitely happens in hazing. But in general, you're a victim, then you're a bystander. Now it's my turn, and I have to do what I was done to me in order to pass on the tradition. Some percentage don't want to do it at all. Some percentage do it with gusto, and some percentage do it because they feel like they have to and they just want to get away with it. I don't think that it's, I don't think we have any research on what those percentages are, but that's my experience.
And I do want to emphasize again what you're saying here, Dr. Lipkins, that they're doing it because they quote unquote need to. This is what we do. And
unfortunately, the families or the groups often reinforce that, like the coaches who say, hey,
absolutely,
this is what we do on our team. Like, what are you going to be, a wuss? And you have to, what goes on in the locker room stays in the locker room. So you better not tell anybody. There's a certain amount of intimidation, and it's covert and it's overt, and, you better not is kind of like communicated pretty quickly.
And I just want to reiterate something I said before, again, not based on research, but based on practice. The vast majority of the cases I've been involved in, the coaching staff or the other leaders have known that something's going on. And the clients I've worked with have come forward to the leadership in one way or another to try to get help, and were essentially given the message that they needed to continue and not disrupt anything.
And then just about societal influences too, because everybody has seen the scene in the movie Animal House where they had the fraternity hazing. You would see in sports reports on TV, more or less as a lighter side of the news kind of story, where you had rookies on a baseball team wearing Halloween costumes or carrying children's backpacks or wearing dresses, walking back to the bullpen. You would see pictures on social media of when a football team would make the rookies buy dinner for everybody else, and they would post the $10,000 restaurant bill that they racked up that they had to pay. When you see things like that, where it's like, oh, it's harmless fun, how do you react to that on TV? Is it possibly perpetuating that cycle?
Absolutely perpetuating it. And I would be really hopeful that the pro football players and pro athletes would support those Northwestern kids who have come forward and say, hey, as a professional, we want hazing to stop. It would be nice for them to do that. I have seen that they've tried to stop hazing and all kinds of abuse in the athletic teams. I think they're working really hard at that, and it still happens.
And then, Dr. Allan or Dr. Stephen too, just, when you see these outside influences that do kind of reinforce the, oh, what's the harm in hazing? How do you react to that?
Well, I think it's important to react to it by trying to have some really important conversations about why it's not funny and about how harmful it really is, because again, it normalizes it, and it sets this expectation for our youth that they should put up with this, they should expect it, it's normal, it's a part of what you're going to experience. And so I think it's really important to speak out and to kind of deconstruct that message and to point out the really harmful and awful consequences.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. We can't minimize it and expect to shift the culture. So it's super important for people to understand why those kinds of things are actually causing harm. And I think once more people understand that, they'll be more likely to speak out and less likely to minimize it. And so I think that's the real opportunity we have from conversations like this. And so I am optimistic that we can get there, but we're not there yet.
Two more questions before we wrap up the program for today. We have seen that there have been a number of lawsuits filed in connection with the hazing scandal at Northwestern. And in your experience and in your research, how many lawsuits related to hazing instances are filed against educational institutions or other institutions? And is this a thing that will be fixed more or less in the courts, that schools and other institutions will put more formalized procedures in place if they know there is a legal financial penalty attached to it?
I'd like to speak to that. I think that in many cases, school systems like high school systems, private schools, colleges are involved in hazing lawsuits. But the whole area of hazing, bullying, and harassment is new in terms of law. Almost all the cases that I have seen actually settle before they go to trial. And the reason is that if the country knew how many millions of dollars they would get by coming forward and breaking the code of silence, the floodgates would open. So the school systems and the colleges and the fraternities and the sororities, they settle because they don't want everybody else to be coming forward. Now, they are in direct opposition to me, who would love everybody to come forward, not because I need more work, but because unfortunately in this country, I don't think we change our behaviors and our culture unless people are getting some kind of significant legal and financial retribution for what's happened to them. So the hazing cases, there are more and more of them, but there are not a lot of them. And most of them that happen are either death, which by the way happens, there are sorority deaths that I've dealt with, as well as fraternity deaths, and a lot of pain and suffering because of athletic and other kinds of hazing and marching band. So they're more, but they're very few, because you really have to get past a threshold for yourself to come forward and actually want to have a hazing case. It has to be that psychologically harmful to you or physically painful to you, so that the damages are significant, both for you, for the attorney who would be dealing with it, and for the courts, as far as I can see.
I would agree that we're seeing a growing number of cases and settlements, and I think it is going to have an impact in terms of motivating colleges and universities or schools to invest in prevention rather than having to pay out after an incident occurs. So it can help to shift the culture. It's not going to be the only thing that's needed, but it's definitely a pressure point.
And I do want to close out by just asking all three, if you're a parent, or if you yourself was involved in a hazing ritual and maybe you've been following this Northwestern story, and you say to yourself, this sounds awfully familiar, and it's dredging up feelings inside of me that I didn't know where they were coming from, but now it's starting to make a lot more sense. What is your message to that person and to that parent? And let's begin with Dr. Stephen.
Reach out, get help, get support, talk about it with people that you trust who can support you. And in reaching out, make sure that you are seeing a psychologist or another type of therapist that actually specializes in trauma, because it is trauma.
Dr. Allan.
Yeah, I would agree. I echo that, absolutely. And also encourage folks to watch the film Hazing, directed by Byron Hurt, H-U-R-T. It was streamed this past year on PBS and will be continue to be available. You can, but in that film, he grapples with this exact thing of having experienced hazing and sort of the years of reflection and how that impacted his life, and how he processes it, and others too in the film. So I think that would be really helpful as well for folks to check that out.
And Dr. Lipkins, you will have the last word.
Okay. Well, I'm going to incorporate everything that everybody said so far. Yes, I think they should consider going into therapy for themselves. I think they should educate themselves not only by Byron's movie, but by everything that's out there in terms of hazing and bullying and harassment, and including possibly going to an attorney in the state that it occurred and saying, hey, these were my damages. This is what happened to me. Is this something that I should be considering having a lawsuit about? So I think that it's multi-level, and it depends on how much harm you have had and how you're feeling about it, and whether you're willing to come forward and tell your story.
Well, I'd like to thank you for this enlightening and illuminating discussion. I hope if you are watching, this can provide an impetus for action, and it could help you recognize the warning signs. I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today, Dr. Susan Lipkins, psychologist and expert witness in hazing cases based in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, Dr. Elizabeth Allan, professor of higher education and program coordinator at the University of Maine, also the principal at Stop Hazing, a research to practice organization. Her website, stophazing.org. Dr. Lipkins' website is insidehazing.com. And thank you again to Dr. Lisa Stephen, personal career and performance coach and psychologist and owner of Ignite Peak Performance in Shelburne, Vermont. Find her online at ignitepeakperformance.com. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for watching. This is Rob Hart, News Radio 780 and 105.9 FM.